So many of the identities we live inside of aren't consciously chosen. They're inherited and absorbed, mostly even observed at a young age. You didn't sit down one day and decide, you know what? I think I'll become the strong one today, the responsible one. I think I'll become the one that never needs help. You know what? I love that title. Those identities were formed early. They formed in families, in school systems, in churches, in jobs that rewarded overfunctioning and punished rest. When those identities are threatened, your system doesn't respond with logic. It responds with panic, anger, irritability, numbness, or even a sense of urgency. That's why you can know intellectually, I deserve rest. I chose this change, yet still feel dysregulated, restless, or empty. This is Hustle Rebels, a podcast for people who know how to grind, but are starting to question the cost. I'm Renee, and here we talk about success, burnout, and nervous system regulation without glorifying exhaustion or sacrificing your health, relationships, or your sense of self, and without pretending ambition is the problem. Let's get into it. If rest makes you anxious instead of relaxed, this episode isn't about time management. It's about identity. When hustle becomes a personality trait, your nervous system learns that motion equals safety. And when motion stops, the system panics. You don't usually question your identity until it's ripped from you. For me, that happened after 3 surgeries in 18 months, and then never stepped foot on a fire engine again. For Patrick, it happened when he injured his shoulder. And when he went back to work, the position he had built his entire identity around was gone. Different stories, same rupture. Because when hustle stops being available, you're forced to face a question most people avoid for as long as they possibly can. Who am I without this? Now, we'll talk more about Patrick next week. You'll actually hear his story directly. But today is about what happens in the space after that role disappears and before a new identity forms. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why hustle becomes identity, why rest and vacations don't actually fix burnout, and what's really underneath the panic that shows up when the hustle disappears. Before we get into it, if this episode already resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you're listening to. Links to everything I mentioned today are going to be in the show notes, so let's get into it. Here's the part that nobody wants to admit out loud. Talking about things that nobody wants to talk about or admit out loud is something I've come to be known for. Most people think they need a vacation. They tell themselves, I just need a break. I just need time off. Once I can finally relax, I'll feel better. So they book the trip. They finally stop working. They finally sit down, and then they can't relax. They're snapping at their kids for spilling ice cream. They lose their shit over cotton candy. They're annoyed that the hotel room is just too loud. They're irritated that nothing feels peaceful enough. Does any of this sound familiar? Suddenly, the thing that you thought would fix you, aka rest, makes you feel worse. Not calmer, not grounded, just on edge. Because the problem was never the lack of time off. The problem is that you don't know who you are when you're not hustling your ass off. We love to pretend that this is about stress management. It's not. It's about identity. When your sense of self is built on being productive, useful, needed, impressive, stillness doesn't feel relaxing. It feels pointless. It feels uncomfortable. It feels like you are wasting your time. So, instead of resting, you pace, you scroll, you drink, you plan, you snap at the people closest to you. Not because you're an asshole, well, I guess you might be, but because hustle became the very thing that told you that you were. And here's the part that can get even more uncomfortable. We all know that life is finite, like conceptually. But do we actually live like it is? Because at any moment, your job could just disappear. Your role could change. Your body could just stop cooperating. Someone above you could decide you're just no longer needed. And if that happens, what's left? That's not meant to be a motivational question. It's a real one. Because we sacrifice everything for these roles. Our time, our bodies, our relationships, our nervous system. And the brutal truth? Most of these systems would replace you before your chair even gets cold. That's the part that hustle culture just never wants you to sit with. And then there's the darker side, the one that none of us really wants to even think about. Car accidents, injuries, medical shit you just never planned for. The moment that your body says, yep, we're just done here. You're not fired, not necessarily burnt out. You're just physically unable. And suddenly the identity you never questioned is gone. No warning, no transition period, no backup plan for who you are now. That's when people end up staring into what feels like a black void, asking themselves, what the fuck do I do now? Who am I if I can't do what I've always done? I've planned for this for the rest of my life. What do I fucking do? And this is the part people don't like hearing. You don't usually question your identity voluntarily. You question it when it's ripped away from you. For me, it was 3 surgeries in 18 months. For Patrick, it was a torn rotator cuff. Different details, same reckoning, because when the hustle disappears, you're left face to face with something most people avoid their entire lives. The fact that they never built an identity outside of what they produce. And this isn't about fear. It's about reality. And if you don't interrogate who you are before that role disappears, heaven forbid, you'll be forced to do it when you're least resourced, least grounded, and least prepared. And that's why this matters. Not because you should slow down, not because you need better boundaries, but because you deserve an identity that survives the job, the injury, the title, and the approval. And this is exactly why next week's conversation with Patrick matters. Because you'll hear what this looks like inside somebody's real life, not as a concept, but as lived experience. But before we go there, we need to keep sitting with this question. Here's something I see over and over again, especially with high performers, first responders, leaders, and people who have spent their lives being the reliable one. Hustle doesn't stay a behavior, it becomes an identity. At some point, the question, what do you do, quietly turns into, who are you? And when that happens, rest doesn't feel restorative. It feels threatening and uncomfortable. Because if you're not producing, not fixing, not handling things, then who are you? This isn't a mindset issue, it's a nervous system pattern. For a lot of people, urgency, that sense of urgency, becomes safety. Productivity becomes their worth. Being in motion becomes belonging. So when the hustle slows or stops, the nervous system panics. Something like this had come up very clearly in the conversation that I had with Patrick, who will, like I said, actually be joining me as a guest next week. So if you haven't subscribed, subscribe now so that you'll be able to hear that conversation with him next week. Something that he said stuck with me. The theme underneath his story was this. He didn't know how to turn it off. Not because he didn't want rest, but because his identity had built around always being on, always moving, always handling things, always hustling. And when that's who you've been for years, slowing down doesn't feel like peace. It feels like standing in a dark room with no instructions and no name tag. Patrick's story is a very real, clear example of how hustle becomes selfhood, not just effort. And this is where I want to layer in my own experience. Because here's the thing. I personally never really felt like I have belonged anywhere. So my identity has almost felt elusive. Not in church, not in the music world, not in EMS, not in the fire world. For a while, I did think that maybe the fire service might finally be it. That brotherhood, I would say sisterhood, but I was the last department, the first and only female. But that culture, the identity. But even there, I was still on the outside looking in. And yet, when I left after my injury, I still felt like losing an identity. I didn't just walk away from a job. I walked away from a version of myself that had a name, a role, and a purpose that made sense to the world. And at the same time, I had this other identity, the musician. My friends used to joke that I was Hannah Montana, the best of both worlds. Firefighter by day, musician by night. Two different worlds, same demand. Performance. One required stoicism, the other required showmanship. But somewhere between the sirens and the stage lights, I lost my voice underneath both of them. Not my singing voice, my own voice. Now that I'm in another identity that truly I never imagined for myself, CEO, entrepreneur, business owner, honestly, that one felt foreign too. But here's what I learned. You can grieve an identity even if it never fully fit. And grief doesn't mean you want something back. This is the part people don't talk about nearly enough either. Grief isn't only about people. You can grieve a role, a uniform, a version of yourself, an identity that once gave you structure, purpose, and a reason to get up in the morning. Even when you know it's the right thing to move on from. That's why identity loss hits so much harder than burnout sometimes. Burnout feels like exhaustion, but identity loss feels like disorientation. It's not just I'm tired, it's I don't know who I am anymore. And that's why rest doesn't fix it. That's why going on vacation doesn't fix it, because what you're actually grieving is the version of you that knew exactly how to exist in the world. It was just ripped from you sometimes. Here's where this goes deeper than mindset or motivation. So many of the identities we live inside of aren't consciously chosen. They're inherited and absorbed. Mostly even observed at a young age. You didn't sit down one day and decide, you know what? I think I'll become the strong one today. Maybe I'll become the responsible one. You know what? I think I'll become the one that never needs help. You know what? I love that title. Those identities were formed early. They formed in families, in school systems, in churches, in jobs that rewarded over-functioning and punished rest. It's the good person, the provider, the good spouse, the rescuer, the high achiever, the one who always seems to hold it all together. And over time, those roles don't just live in your thoughts. They rewire themselves into your nervous system. So your body learns, I'm safe when I'm useful. I'm valued when I'm productive. I belong when I'm needed. So when those identities are threatened or taken away, your system doesn't respond with logic. It responds with panic, anger, irritability, numbness, or even a sense of urgency. That's why you can know intellectually, conceptually, I deserve rest. I chose this change, or I'm better off now. Yet still feel in your body, feel dysregulated, feel restless or empty, because your nervous system hasn't caught up yet. It's somatically connected. And this is why people do things that just don't make sense to them anymore. Why you keep saying yes when you're just physically exhausted, or why you feel guilty when you slow down. Snapping at your kids on the one vacation that you needed, or why you feel more comfortable in chaos than calm. It's not because you don't want peace. I guarantee that you want that peace. But it's because peace threatens the identity that has kept you safe for so long. So your system tries to recreate the familiar, even when it's hurting you. And this is the part that so many people skip over. You don't just replace an identity. You have to separate who you are from what you do. Slowly, intentionally, and with awareness. Otherwise, you're just swapping costumes, right? Different job, same nervous system. Same patterns, same exhaustion. You're just dressed up differently. That's why nervous system work matters so much. It's also why I'm doing a free webinar February 15th through the 17th over President's Day weekend. We'll be going much deeper into this. We're going to be talking about how identities are inherited and absorbed, how they rewire themselves into your nervous system, and why you keep doing what you're doing even when it just doesn't make sense anymore. If you want the details on that, the best place to get them is by signing up for my weekly recharge newsletter. That's where the links, context, and reminders are going to be sent out to you, and you'll find all of those links in the show notes. So let's bring this all together. And if you haven't listened to last week's episode, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that because ties in very well with this week where I talked about alienation theory and how it has been woven into extreme capitalism and losing your identity in many ways. But if there's one thing to take away from this episode, it's this. Most people don't burn out because they work too hard. They burn out because their identity became fused with what they produce. Hustle stops being a strategy and turns into a personality trait, and their worth gets tied to usefulness. Stillness starts to feel wrong, and when that role disappears, whether by injury, burnout, restructuring, or something completely out of your control, the exhaustion isn't what hurts the most. It's the disorientation, that hollow feeling of not knowing who you are without the hustle telling you who to be. That's why vacations don't calm you. And that's why you can choose change yet still feel angry, irritable, empty, or just always on edge. Because what you're actually grieving is a version of yourself that once knew exactly how to exist. And until that grief is acknowledged, not rushed, not bypassed, not rebranded, it will keep showing up in your nervous system and all of your relationships. Next week, you'll hear this conversation continue with Patrick, directly from him. You'll hear what it's like to have an identity built around hustle and performance, and what happens when that identity gets disrupted in real time. This episode was about naming the pattern, and next episode is about hearing it lived. If this hits something in you, check out the show notes. That's where you'll find the link to my weekly recharge newsletter, which is the best place to stay connected and get the details on upcoming work, including the free webinar happening February 15th through the 17th, where we'll go deeper into how inherited identities shape your nervous system and drive behavior long after they have stopped serving you. And if you want to support the podcast, sharing this episode or leaving a review goes a long way. I'll leave you with this. If you weren't allowed to hustle tomorrow, who would you be? I'll see you guys next week.